glad to be here. Thank you.
The first question is it crucial to organize economy differently in the future?
Yes.
And why is that?
Yes.
What's the problem with the way it is now?
So it's basically because the economy is so problematic right now that we're having a lot of the sustainability crises that we're seeing. So climate change, biodiversity loss, inequality, a lot of those are driven by the economic system we have now. And that's because the for-profit type of economy we have, or you can call it capitalism, is expansionary inherently, like by nature. Because in order to produce more and more profit for investors and owners, has to constantly sell more and more products and services. And so that is done by converting nature into goods and services, converting social relationships into services that can be sold on the market. And so more and more of the natural world and of our social world, our social lives, becomes part of the economy. And degrowth activists call this economism. And so you can sort of see this manifest in the way we have our social goals and our political goals set up in economic terms. So like quality of life is often defined in monetary terms as like GDP per person or income per person. Nations' political goals are often revolve around GDP growth. And we even end up arguing for protecting people on the planet in economic terms increasingly, right? So in order to argue to save a forest or something, conservationists have gone into this economic language. Well, we have to come up with the price tag. How much is it worth to save it versus cut it down? And so because the economy is expansionary in this way, we have to change that if we want to actually protect people and planet.
In other words, we run out of resources.
We run out of resources, we drive climate change, we drive biodiversity loss. People are exploited in the process. People who are already sort of living in poverty or at the edges of society are those that are most vulnerable to be exploited by this expansionary capitalist system. So if we want to have a sustainable society in which everybody's needs are equitably met within the ecological limits of the planet, we have to change the way the economy is set up.
And how would you explain your not-for-profit economic structure?
Mm-hmm. So the model I've been working on for the past 10 years or so is, we call it the not-for-profit world model. And it's basically a model of a not-for-profit market economy. The clearest way to explain this, or the simplest way to explain this, is that there's a difference in the purpose of economic institutions. So in the for-profit way of organizing the economy, which is the way that the economy is organized in most of the world right now, the purpose of economic institutions like businesses and banks and financial institutions is to enrich their owners, to seek financial gain for private investors and owners. And so that's one of the key purposes embedded in these institutions. A not-for-profit market economy, on the other hand, would have the key purpose of social benefit, of meeting people's needs and even meeting environmental needs. And so that difference in purpose really changes the structure of the economy and accordingly the outcomes and the consequences of the economy. So that a not-for-profit market economy could actually be post-growth, meaning that it wouldn't necessarily drive or require constant growth, which that's one of the major problems we have right now with the current economy, is that it's so growth-driven.
How would companies in your model be owned?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So and I should clarify that this model, this not-for-profit market economy, is based on existing forms of business. So when we started this work, we did this scoping work to try to see, could we find not-for-profit types of business in all sectors of the economy and all over the world? Or was it like, is it maybe too small of a phenomenon to base this model on? And what we found was, yeah, there are not-for-profit businesses in every sector of the economy all over the world. I'm not going to say every country because we didn't have the research power to figure that out, but we did find them on every continent, lots of different cultural contexts. And so one of the key differences between for-profit business and not-for-profit business, aside from this purpose point that I mentioned earlier, is ownership. These types of businesses have no private financial ownership. So when we talk about ownership, I've found that it's really important and convenient to break it up into two pieces. There is financial ownership, so who financially benefits from the business, who can receive the profit and the assets, and then there's the control part of ownership, who makes the decisions for the business. And so for not-for-profit businesses, there's no private financial ownership. All of the resources, all of the surplus and assets have to be used for that core social benefit mission that the business was set up to deliver, whether that's alleviating poverty or delivering healthy, sustainable food or protecting the environment. For-profit businesses, on the other hand, have private financial ownership. So then, private owners can receive dividends from the profit every year.
So what would this model solve?
Yeah, this is a really important question. So in my work, what I've discovered is the financial gain purpose and the private financial ownership of the for-profit economy, of for-profit businesses, drives a lot of really bad problems in the world. So it drives overconsumption because, again, going back to this idea that the purpose is to deliver financial surplus to the owners, companies have to constantly try to expand their sales. Selling more things means more profit for the owners, right? But with that consumption and overconsumption that we have now, there are also environmental impacts, right? So that ties to emissions and climate change, it ties to biodiversity loss, soil degradation, all kinds of environmental problems. Also, it's driving inequality, because as these private owners accumulate wealth, which is part of the purpose of the whole economic setup, so they're accumulating private wealth, and at the same time, there's a built-in incentive to keep wages as low as possible as a cost of doing business, right? So the higher the wages, the less the profit. So you want to keep wages low, and owners keep accumulating money, and so we're getting this incredible rising level of inequality around the world between countries, but also within countries. So it's driving environmental problems, overconsumption, inequality, but it also, and this is very key, it's driving market concentration and political capture. So the bigger a company becomes, the more profit it can get. So there's a built-in incentive for companies to become quite large and powerful. And there's also a built-in incentive to use that wealth and power to influence policy in order to protect the profits of the company, right? And we're seeing that as well all over the world, that companies are investing in lobbying politicians in order to get subsidies or fight down regulations and taxes that would take away from their profit. And so we've got this state of what Oxfam and others have called political capture. And so if we transition away from for-profit types of business and to not-for-profit types of business, then we are leaning away from that financial gain purpose to social benefit purpose, away from private financial ownership to social ownership, basically, of companies. But it's distributed social ownership because it's a market economy. So it can resolve a lot of those problems. I mean, inequality would be, we would have much more equality in a not-for-profit type of economy because we wouldn't have private owners accumulating wealth from businesses, and we wouldn't have the built-in incentive to keep wages low. There wouldn't be a built-in incentive to expand consumption and production constantly to deliver profit to owners. There wouldn't be the incentive to change policies in order to enrich private owners, right? So it would align much better with redistributional taxes and environmental protection regulations and regulations to protect workers, for instance. So it could actually serve to solve a lot of the problems that we're facing today in a very systemic way by changing the goal and structure of the economy.
So it sounds to me like the incentive to deceive customers would be less. So would in general, how would marketing change in not-for-profit businesses?
So marketing would be quite different because, I mean, and you already can see that with not-for-profit businesses in the market today. There tends to be a lot more transparency, a lot more information given to customers. So if you think, for instance, of a charity shop, then consumers are sort of willing often to pay a little bit extra to contribute to the profit of those companies because they know where the profit's going. It's going to help people facing homelessness, or it's going to help children facing poverty, that sort of thing. So there's a lot more transparency and information available to customers because of the social benefit purpose of the companies. They have an incentive to be transparent and allow customers to have more information. So that's one important thing. Another important thing is that, like I said before, there isn't this built-in incentive to just sell more for the sake of profit. So all of the incentive for selling goods and services is tied directly to let's meet people's needs. Let's meet the needs and challenges of our community. And so there's not, if, for instance, I have a not-for-profit business that is set up to deliver childhood nutrition in a community. There's a sort of a limit there, right? We're not going to just keep feeding kids after their nutrition has been met and make them obese. That would sort of counteract the whole aim. So there's like an ethic of enough built into not-for-profit types of business, rather than this ethic of more that's built into for-profit types of business.
But you're still competing with other companies, right? And I also think, I mean, if you work in a company, you want to keep your salary, or how would you assume that unemployment would change in these structures?
Unemployment. So a few things. One thing is that this type of economy, a not-for-profit type of economy, would allow for shorter work weeks. It would allow us to work less, which is one of these key proposals that you get from degrowth and post-growth economics, is that we should all be working a bit less. And so if you tie that in with automation, for instance, right now, automation is a huge threat to workers, because then they become unemployed, and when they're unemployed, there's like this lack of a safety net in most communities, and so then you're just sort of at real risk of poverty and destitution. In the not-for-profit type of economy, we could share the work that needs to be done. Automation would not be a threat because it's not privately owned by a handful of private owners. So right now, a lot of the automation is owned by for-profit companies, which are then owned by private owners. And so the profits of that automation are contributing to these inequality dynamics. People are getting unemployed, and a handful of wealthy owners are getting the profit from that. So in a not-for-profit type of economy, because all of the profit from automation would go back into social benefit purposes, it could actually relieve inequality, reduce poverty, rather than increase it the way that it does now. So that's one thing to consider. Another thing is that the market itself sort of becomes a bit of a safety net. So we still need the public safety net from governments, especially in places where it's very functional, like in Nordic countries right now. But then the market itself also becomes a bit of a safety net, because you have all of these businesses in the market that are using their profit for these social benefit missions to help alleviate poverty, to meet needs and whatnot. So you have both a state safety net system and a market safety net system. And so unemployment doesn't become such a threat.
how would you imagine workplaces would change in this concept? How would it be going to work? How would that change?
So again, coming back to this core difference of purpose, I think that's really important for work, right? And we spend so much of our lives working, and I just said we could have a shorter work week in the not-for-profit world, which is important. But we would still spend a significant portion of our lives working. And so to have work that you know has a direct impact on people's lives, on meeting the needs of the community, is a really important source of purpose in one's work and one's life. So you'd have that sort of increase in purposeful work that has a clear and direct purpose in the not-for-profit economy. And then, like I said, you could also work less, so that's good too.
And are workplaces more democratic?
So they can be. And this is where I like to make sure to point out that the not-for-profit world I see it as necessary but not sufficient. So it's necessary in that we have to get away from the for-profit way of organizing the economy. I don't see how that could ever be made sustainable. So it's necessary in that sense. But it's not sufficient. So just by having everything not-for-profit doesn't mean that everything would suddenly be perfectly democratic or perfectly ecologically friendly. So there are other things that we need to keep in mind to build into it if we want those things. That said, we have found examples of worker-directed not-for-profit companies. So just like a worker co-op, but it's not-for-profit. And so you can have those more democratic decision-making processes, definitely. But they're not an inherent feature. You can also have really top-down CEO, financial manager, that sort of more hierarchical structure, which some could argue that's an important element, is that you can have that more diverse forms of governance in the market than just everything being democratically managed.
So next question is, how would you say it is today when it comes to the decision making on what resources in nature would be used for what?
How are those decisions made now in the
Yes.
for-profit
Yeah.
economy? Yeah. Right. Well, it's a good question. I would argue that it's largely dictated by the profit motive. It's dictated by how much money can be made from the natural resources. And that's largely based on an assumption from neoclassical economics, and just maybe a larger social assumption, that it's okay if we make money, if we generate wealth from these natural resources now, then we'll have money and we can innovate some technology to make up for that nature, or we'll grow new nature in the future because we'll have the money to do that, which is a fairly absurd assumption, because it's in ecological economics, it's called the substitutability assumption, that money can substitute for nature. And obviously it can't, because once we tear apart ecosystems, which have evolved over millennia to have a level of complexity and symbiosis that they have, once we tear that down, there's no way we can build that back up with our technology or our money. So that's how resources are treated now, I would say. And so, yeah, it's free market capitalism. A lot of people say, of course, it's not a free market. There's no such thing as a free market. But I mean, as I mentioned earlier, with the political capture element of the for-profit economy, there's not a really clear distinction between governments and large transnational corporations these days. They're really collaborating to fulfill this private financial gain mission of the economy. So that's how resources are treated now. I would guess that your next question is how would that change with the not-for-profit economy? And that would change drastically, again, because of the purpose, because the economy would be oriented towards meeting social needs. and environmental needs. Again, that's where I would bring in the necessary but not sufficient. To make it sufficient, we really have to bring environmental needs and environmental protection into the fold, into not-for-profit business structures, but also into the policies governing the not-for-profit market. And so it would be a market that is selling goods and services to meet people's needs. But again, needs can be fulfilled, so there's this ethic of enough. There's a constant sort of monitoring of the needs and challenges in the community and whether people have enough or not. So once we have enough, maybe we don't have to produce more goods and services. Maybe we don't have to sell more stuff. We can sort of have this steady state economy, or even a shrinking economy if we've sort of gone too far. And then, of course, a really important element of that is the government and researchers keeping track of what is the state of the natural environment in which this economic activity is happening. Are we using too much? And how can we reduce that? So at this point, we're clearly using too much in most communities of the world. So we would need to reduce it. And I think that tying it directly to needs satisfaction can do that. And I mean tying economic institutions directly to the satisfaction of people's needs can help us reduce economic activity.
How would you say that, maybe you already answered this, but how would resources be distributed better than it is now? This model.
Yeah, and this comes back to the question of inequality, I think. We're living in a world where there are a handful of billionaires. Actually not, it's relative, right? There's more than 2,500 billionaires in the world now. But a relative handful of people are billionaires. They have yachts and private jets and several homes and even private islands, while we have, I think the last time I looked at the statistic, it was 800,000 or 800 million people who aren't even having their basic nutritional needs met. And so, it's very easy to see that needs to be redistributed. We need, people don't need yachts and private jets and more than one home. So we've got to have a massive redistribution of wealth. And then the not-for-profit world, or the not-for-profit market economy, can keep the flow of resources moving in a circular way rather than accumulating in the hands of a few, directed again by where there is need. So all of the profit goes to where are there needs, who needs this profit, who can benefit most from this. So the market again becomes a distributional mechanism.
And this is probably a difficult question. How do you see that this model could be realized?
That's where the rubber hits the road, so to speak. What can we do now to make this sort of transition happen? If we acknowledge, yeah, we have to get away from the for-profit economy, and this is actually a really concrete option, let's do it. There are changes on all levels that I think need to happen. So there's policy changes that need to take away the advantages that for-profit companies, and especially large for-profit companies, currently have in the economy. And then policies that can support existing not-for-profit businesses, prioritize not-for-profit businesses, for instance, in public procurement policies, and can support the growing of new not-for-profit businesses, the incubation of new not-for-profit businesses. So those are some policy level things that can happen. As consumers, we need to shift our consumption away, especially from the largest for-profit companies, towards not-for-profit companies that exist. So one really important thing that needs to happen is sort of like community maps or directories, so people even know where the not-for-profit businesses in their communities are, because most of us aren't really aware of which companies in our communities are for-profit or not-for-profit. And the for-profit companies need to be encouraged to shift into not-for-profit structures, which can happen. So, for instance, a for-profit company can be bought out by a not-for-profit foundation, and then with that shift in ownership, that company effectively becomes not-for-profit itself. In terms of, I think that, on the softer level of values and norms, there has to be a shift in basically a social movement. We need a large-scale social movement. And I don't think we're starting from scratch there. I think there are already existing social movements around the world that are becoming increasingly connected over common causes, like inequality, like the environment, climate change. So if we can, and I think a lot of them are actively looking for alternative economic models. They're starting to realize that the current way of the current economic setup is not okay. It's part of the problem. And so if we can get these ideas into those networked social movements, I think that could be very powerful. Because then with that kind of social momentum, we raise awareness that these alternatives are possible, that these alternatives already exist to some extent. We can pressure policymakers, we can pressure companies to change, and we can help support the thriving and flourishing of the not-for-profit economy that already exists, and just support it, make it bigger, make it stronger.
And how are they doing now, these not-for-profit businesses that are already existing?
I mean, it depends on where you are. I think that different sort of policy and cultural contexts make a difference. So in some places, it's fairly easy to start and run a business as a not-for-profit. Like in the US, you see a lot of examples where you can just have a not-for-profit that does business activities and earns a profit, and all of that is not, it's not uncommon at all. In some places there are, for instance, my husband's Greek and I lived in Greece. Greece makes it a little bit harder for not-for-profit businesses because it sort of puts a cap on the amount of business income that not-for-profits can earn. It sort of tries to make this distinction between either you're a business or you're not-for-profit. And that's not helpful at all for the kind of shift that I'm talking about, right? So it depends on where you are. But we found a lot of really strong, flourishing not-for-profit businesses. So the YHA in the UK, which is this hostel association, is a not-for-profit business. It earns its revenue through selling recreation or accommodation. So it runs these hostels. It takes fees for the hostels and the accommodation it provides, and all of the profit goes into helping kids in the city get out of the city and experience nature. And that is a not-for-profit business that has been successful and going on, I think, for like 85 years or something. So you get these kinds of examples of not-for-profit businesses sort of against all odds in this for-profit economy that can be quite ruthless, doing quite well. So if we can, raise awareness and bring more support for them, I think that this transition is actually quite feasible.
This is still a market economy. Do you see any problem in the market structure as in general when it comes to allocating resources?
I think that if it's only left to the market and we don't have some sort of regulations or restrictions around the market, then yeah, it can be really problematic to just trust even a not-for-profit market to always do the right thing. So we have to keep an eye on it, Are these businesses, is this market actually filling the needs that it's meant to? Is it actually respecting the environment in the way that it's meant to, that we need it to? So, I mean, I wouldn't say that the market on its own is good enough. But I would say in comparison to more centralized, obviously in comparison to the for-profit market, the not-for-profit market is better. But also in comparison to like state-planned types of economies, I think those are very vulnerable to corruption, right? Because it also tends to concentrate power in the hands of a few people who are working in the state and planning the economy for everybody else. And with that concentration of power, it's very, if corruption seeps in, it can be very destructive, as we've seen in some real-life experiments with state-planned economies. So I think the market is maybe not the perfect system or a perfect system, but I think it's a really good allocation system in comparison to other things that have been tried. And I want to point out that it's not a new thing, right? We've had markets in human communities for millennia. And so it's something that, brings people together. You go to the marketplace to exchange goods and services. And it's a vibrant part of social life, or it historically has been that way in community and traditional economy. So I think we can bring that element back in by reorienting the purpose of the economy.
How would ordinary life look like in a not-for-profit economy? What would change in our lives?
Yeah, I mean, so much. So I've often thought about writing sort of like a day of the life in a not-for-profit world, and just sort of, because I can think of it, I can see it in my head very clearly, like waking up and sort of having this, yay, I get to go to work, because my work is actually helping people in my community. So that's an exciting thing for me to do. I get to interact with other people at my job. We all are sort of inspired by this purposeful work. I can come home early because I don't have to work a 40-hour work week. I can then spend some of my leisure time, growing my own food, tending my vegetable patch, playing music. There's a lot more free time. There's a lot more time to meet our diverse needs in many different ways. So right now in the for-profit economy, we're kind of told that all of our needs should be met through the market, through goods and services. And so in the not-for-profit type of economy, though, we can acknowledge actually most of our needs are better met through connection with ourselves, through connection with each other, through connection with nature. And we don't have to spend money or buy goods and services to meet those needs. So it would leave the space to meet our needs in healthier ways.
Can you say 3 things that we can do tomorrow to come closer to your vision?
So 3 things. I would say the first one is sort of this softer level of raising awareness and building up social momentum. So we should have discussions about this, about the not-for-profit world economy, about alternative economic models, and we should spread the information, raise awareness, have these discussions, create social momentum. Because the more social momentum we have, the more we can pressure economic actors and policymakers to move in the direction that we need them to. The second thing is to push for those policy changes. So to take away the unfair advantages that large for-profit companies currently enjoy, sort of the subsidies that they get. They are often prioritized in public procurement policies. We can instead flip that to prioritize or favor not-for-profit forms of business. Governments can put funding into helping start up not-for-profit businesses and support existing ones. So that's sort of like the policy level. And the third one is to support existing not-for-profit efforts, because there are already a lot of not-for-profit businesses that already exist. There are a lot of social entrepreneurs that would like to start not-for-profit types of business, but they're not sure if they can or how they can. So we can support them by identifying them, mapping out the not-for-profit businesses in our communities, shifting our consumption to support them wherever we can, and working for them, maybe even volunteering with them, and raising awareness about them.
And when you tell about your model, what misunderstanding are you used to, or even critique?
Yeah, no, it's a good. Okay, so there are misunderstandings, and then there's some objections, and I'll start with a couple of common misunderstandings, which come back to, I call it Cold War trauma, because it's kind of this way that we've all inherited of thinking that there are only 2 ways to organize the economy. There's either capitalism, which I call the for-profit economy, Or there's the state-planned economy, right? And then it brings images of the Soviets, Soviet Union, of Maoist China. And so we're stuck in this dichotomized thinking. And so my work is often misunderstood as some people say, okay, but you're just talking about communism. And it's like, no, but this is a market economy, so it's not the state-planned thing that you're thinking of. It's a market economy. And then on the other hand, some people say, well, no, you're just talking about capitalism. And then I have to clarify, well, no, it's a market economy, but it's not a capitalist market economy because there's no capitalist to receive the profit. So that's a common misunderstanding. The other common misunderstanding is sort of this response, well, the nonprofit model is broken. And what people mean by that is often, if you think about all of these nonprofits, they're just trying to clean up, these messes, but they're actually contributing to the problems as well because they're receiving funding from these large corporations. And that's where I come back to clarify the distinction. I'm talking about not-for-profit businesses, not charity-dependent nonprofits. And it's a crucial difference because a lot of these charity-dependent nonprofits are sort of extensions of the for-profit economy themselves. They were set up as for instance, the Gates Foundation is an extension of the Gates family and Microsoft even, and their own agenda. And so I have to really distinguish that because these are businesses, they are financially self-sufficient. They don't have to depend on wealthy philanthropists or for-profit company donations. And then objections. It's funny because I don't get so many objections once these points have been clarified. But one of the objections that I get is that this is too radical. It's too much of a transformation. And so we should really just, people will say, I can't imagine this big of a transformation happening, so we should just focus on making the for-profit economy sustainable. And then I come back and I say, okay, how are you going to do that, though, if the for-profit nature of the economy is sort of one of the root problems in the first place? And so it's always an interesting discussion about what is possible in terms of transformation or not. And that's part of why I think the work that you guys are doing is so cool, because you're really opening up the imaginary space, for can we imagine these transformations? Can we imagine alternative systems? And there are those of us who can. I remember you were going to ask about the participatory economy and
decentralized planned economy. But are you familiar enough to?
I can comment broadly. Yeah. So the participatory economy is very much aligned, I think, with what I'm saying. Like, I can imagine a future in which we have only not-for-profit types of economies. And some of those are not-for-profit markets, and some of those are more like these council-led participatory economies. And I don't think that those would be in any sort of conflict, or they wouldn't be mutually inclusive. They could coexist. It could be part of this diverse future of economic alternatives, and I think it's beautiful. So that's one thing on the participatory economy. And then when it comes to democratic, the democratic economy, which I've interpreted as sort of a worker co-op-led economy, I think the only risk there is that if it's not explicitly done in a not-for-profit way, then it risks bumping into or driving some of these problematic dynamics of the for-profit economy. So I think that could be done in a not-for-profit way or a for-profit way, and that's where I would urge people in that space to really take this distinction seriously.
And the democratic economy is also, you got rid of financial market in that structure.
Yes, and so that's, I think, maybe another question you wanted to ask me about, was financial markets. What happens to financial markets? Which is interesting because currently, in the for-profit economy, financial markets are mostly, stock markets based on equity shares. So that's only possible in for-profit forms of business, that you own a share or a piece of equity in the company. In a not-for-profit company, you can't have that. That's the financial ownership I was talking about. So a lot of the financial markets that we see today would also sort of go away in this transition to a not-for-profit type of economy. The only thing that might still exist and might still be useful are bond markets, and a bond, you can think of it as sort of like a loan. It's a debt-based instrument for financing things, and so just like a business might take out a loan from a bank, and preferably a not-for-profit bank, and then work and repay the loan with a little bit of interest. Same sort of thing happens when it issues bonds. Then if you buy a bond to support the startup of my not-for-profit company, for instance, then I'll pay you back the bond with a little bit of interest. And then the idea with the interest there is that it should be low, it should be a low rate, it should be fair, and just sort of tied to inflation and other expenses that you might encounter through that bond instrument. But it shouldn't be to make you rich.
Maybe about basic income models? What do you think about those?
Yeah, basic income, I think it's a great idea, right? Like if we all get paid an unconditional amount, then we don't have to worry, we don't have to force ourselves to go do work that we don't really want to do. We don't have to do a lot of the things that we are compromising ourselves to do in the for-profit economy. So I think that it's a really interesting idea. I wouldn't mind having a basic income. My main critique of it is the way that it's often framed now in discussions is as a systemic solution. And I don't think that it is a systemic solution. If you implement a basic income in a for-profit economy, it's not going to solve inequality. It's not going to solve the environmental problems. It's going to be a little bit of a Band-Aid on a gaping wound, or just trying to plug up a leaking pipe that's bursting. So we actually need to get to the roots of the problems. And then a basic income could be a useful tool for sort of redistributing wealth. Like I said, we have so much inequality right now that we do have to redistribute the wealth somehow. And so basic income could be a useful tool for that, but as part of a more radical shift. It's not going to actually solve our problems within the same type of economy.
Do you know any other models or theories that you find inspiring?
The only other thing that you guys have not already asked me about that I keep coming across in my literature, and I've built on a little bit, like I've incorporated bits of it into my own work, is the social and solidarity economy work. And so there's, a big movement for the social and solidarity economy around South America, around Southern Europe. When I was in Greece, there's a festival, an annual festival, and a large network of people involved in trying to push for the social and solidarity economy. The reason I haven't gone more with that framing, there's a couple of reasons. One is that it's often just talked about or written about as sort of something that exists within the capitalist economy. It's like we also need a social and solidarity economy in addition to the capitalist market. And I think, no, actually we need the whole economy to shift to social benefit purpose and away from financial gain. So that's one thing. And the other thing is it's not very clear about the legal frameworks or the legal structures that should be included in a social and solidarity economy versus not. Whereas I think the for-profit, not-for-profit distinction is very helpful in weeding out what is fundamentally unsustainable and what can be sustainable.
I don't know if you agree, but I expect that we will pretty soon be hit by a major financial crisis. I can't see how we can avoid that, and I talk about something much bigger than 2008. What should we do then?
What should we do then? I think that's part of why it's so important to build the groundwork now. You know, and so when the next crisis hits, we already have something ready, you know, and that, again, that happens on many different levels. So that means like having a package of policy proposals to hand politicians. It means having a social movement ready to jump on that opportunity to raise awareness about this is happening and we knew it would happen because it's part of a systemic structure. It's part of a systemic problem. And then when you have these clear answers and these clear responses and you're ready for it, and you have alternatives, concrete alternatives for how we can transition or change away, I think it could be really a powerful opportunity for change. It could actually catalyze change. And I think that the previous crises, so the crisis of 2008, but also the pandemic now, have increasingly pushed more and more people out of their comfort zone in the for-profit economy. And so that being out of their comfort zone makes them more open to alternatives and even more active in seeking out alternatives. So I think there's already this sort of appetite. And when the next crisis hits, which like you say, it's inevitable, if there are concrete solutions already there within reach, it could be a great moment for transition to really set in.